Hello, join us on a time-traveling adventure as we unearth the extraordinary events that shaped our world.
The Opium Wars, a series of conflicts between China and Britain in the 19th century, stand as a poignant chapter in the annals of world history. These wars, characterized by a blend of economic interests, cultural clashes, and imperial ambitions, left an indelible mark on both nations and reverberated across the globe. In this comprehensive account, we shall embark on a journey through the intricate web of events, motivations, and consequences that define the Opium Wars. From the background and causes that ignited the conflicts to the lasting legacies they imprinted on the modern world, each chapter will provide a meticulous examination of this pivotal historical episode. The Opium Trade. In the early 19th century, the complex interplay of geopolitics, economics, and addiction converged to create the catalyst for one of the most consequential conflicts in modern history, the Opium Wars between China and Britain. At the dawn of the 19th century, China stood as a tantalizing and seemingly boundless market for British merchants. Yet the Middle Kingdom was a realm apart, ensconced behind its self-imposed barriers. Foreign trade with China was strictly regulated, and access was channeled primarily through the port of Canton, known today as Guangzhou. This arrangement was in keeping with China's traditional stance of maintaining its isolation from the outside world, a stance that had persisted for centuries. The Chinese government, under the Qin dynasty, zealously guarded its sovereignty and sought to control all aspects of foreign interaction. This included, most significantly, the imposition of a trade system called Canton System, which restricted foreign merchants to conducting their business in a designated area, outside the walls of Canton. This severely limited both the geographic scope and the volume of trade that foreign merchants could engage in. For British traders, this situation was deeply frustrating. They saw China as an untapped reservoir of wealth and opportunity. However, the trade balance between China and Britain was significantly lopsided. Britain imported vast quantities of Chinese goods, primarily tea, porcelain, and silk, for which it paid in silver. This silver drain was causing considerable economic strain on Britain, depleting its reserves of precious metal. Desperation, it is often said, is the mother of innovation. And so, British merchants and traders, keenly aware of the urgent need to address this trade deficit, found their solution in an unexpected source: opium. This narcotic substance, cultivated in British-controlled India, was a highly lucrative commodity with a ready market in China. Its intoxicating properties had already led to a growing addiction crisis in the Middle Kingdom, making it a commodity of enormous demand. The British East India Company, which held a monopoly on opium production in India, saw an opportunity to turn this addictive substance into a profitable export. They began flooding the Chinese market with opium, often through illicit and covert means, in direct violation of Chinese laws that strictly prohibited its import and sale. The profits reaped from this illicit trade were staggering, and British merchants soon found themselves amassing enormous wealth through this clandestine commerce. This illicit opium trade, while immensely profitable for British merchants, ignited a powder cave of social and political turmoil within China. The widespread addiction to opium wreaked havoc on Chinese society, leading to a surge in health problems, social disintegration, and a drastic loss of productivity. The Chinese government, increasingly alarmed by the consequences of this drug trade, undertook various efforts to curb it, including the seizure and destruction of opium stocks. The stage was thus set for a clash of interests and values between China and Britain. On one side, a deeply rooted and ancient empire, striving to maintain its sovereignty and cultural integrity. On the other, a burgeoning global power driven by economic imperatives and the pursuit of profit. This clash would ultimately erupt into a series of conflicts known to history as the Opium Wars, which would have profound and enduring implications for both nations and the world at large. The opium trade escalates. Opium, a commodity of profound consequence, emerged as the fulcrum upon which the fate of two great nations balanced during the early 19th century. Its journey from a mere cash crop to a catalyst for confrontation between China and Britain is a testament to the intricate interplay of economic interests, addiction, and imperial ambitions. In the vast expanses of British-controlled India, opium production flourished under the aegis of the British East India Company. The fertile fields of the Ganges Delta and the fertile Gangetic Plains became the epicenters of a burgeoning opium industry. This narcotic substance, harvested from the opium poppy, was processed, packaged, and shipped to the bustling ports of Calcutta and Bombay. From these Indian ports, opium began its transformative voyage across the seas to China, the Middle Kingdom. For British merchants, it became a lucrative trade commodity, a source of immense wealth that promised to reverse their dire trade deficit with China. The Chinese authorities, however, were not blind to the devastation that opium wrought upon their society. Recognizing the perilous path on which the nation was embarking, they took steps to stem the tide of this narcotic deluge. Attempts to ban the import and sale of opium were made, but these efforts often proved feeble in the face of entrenched commercial interests and the sheer scale of the trade. Despite the determined efforts of Chinese officials, the opium trade burgeoned. Illicit smuggling, bribery, and the complicity of some Chinese officials with British merchants fueled the growth of this black market. British traders found ingenious ways to circumvent Chinese restrictions, including concealing opium in various cargo shipments, such as tea. This exponential growth in the opium trade did more than simply increase the coffers of British merchants. It also unleashed a social and public health crisis of unprecedented proportions in China. Opium addiction spread like wildfire, cutting across all social strata. It eroded the fabric of Chinese society, tearing families apart and turning productive individuals into wretched addicts. The opium dens, where individuals would gather to indulge in this addictive substance, became symbols of the moral decay that accompanied the trade. Public health issues escalated with the widespread use of opium, leading to a population plagued by debilitating physical and mental afflictions. As opium's grip tightened on the nation, China's productivity suffered, and social order began to disintegrate. This disturbing escalation in the opium trade, with all its attendant consequences, set the stage for a collision of interests that would soon erupt into open conflict. China's desperate attempts to halt the spread of opium were met with indifference, if not outright defiance, by British merchants and their government. The deepening quagmire of addiction and social decay cast a long, ominous shadow over Sino-British relations, heralding the arrival of the Opium Wars, a pivotal moment in world history where the destinies of two nations hung precariously in the balance. The Lin Zexu episode. In the annals of history, the year 1839 marks a pivotal juncture in the saga of the Opium Wars, an epochal conflict that would leave an indelible imprint on both China and Britain. This momentous year witnessed the appointment of a man who would play a central role in the unfolding drama, a figure whose actions would become legendary: Lin Zexu, the Chinese imperial commissioner entrusted with the Herculean task of eradicating the pernicious opium trade. Lin Zexu, a scholar official of remarkable intellect and unimpeachable integrity, was dispatched to the heart of the opium epidemic in Canton, modern-day Guangzhou. His mission was unequivocal: to quash the opium trade and cleanse Chinese society of the virulent poison that had seeped into its very veins. Upon his arrival in Canton, Lin Zexu wasted no time in implementing a series of bold and uncompromising measures. His actions, driven by a sense of moral duty and an unwavering commitment to his emperor, would reverberate across history. One of Lin's first acts was to issue a stern edict, a clarion call to the British and other foreign traders, demanding the immediate surrender of their opium stocks. He spared no effort in meticulously cataloging these illicit reserves, an ominous testament to the scale of the trade. British merchants, apprehensive but cognizant of the determination of this man, reluctantly complied with the imperial order. It was an act of capitulation that would prove to be a precursor to the cataclysmic events that would follow. The culminating moment, which would be etched into the annals of history as the Opium War incident, unfolded in dramatic fashion. Lin Zexu's uncompromising resolve reached its zenith as he ordered the mass confiscation and destruction of the seized opium. Thousands of chests of this narcotic substance were reduced to ashes in a public spectacle that symbolized China's defiance against the poison that had afflicted its people. This audacious act, while celebrated by some as a heroic stand against the scourge of opium, was viewed with a mixture of consternation and outrage by British authorities. The destruction of the opium, an act perceived as a gross violation of property rights, provoked a diplomatic crisis between China and Britain. The Opium War incident served as a harbinger of the tumultuous events that would ensue. It was an act that starkly highlighted the irreconcilable clash of values, interests, and sovereignty that underpinned the Opium Wars. Lin Zexu's unwavering commitment to the eradication of opium would have far-reaching consequences, propelling China and Britain inexorably toward a confrontation that would reshape the course of history. In the persona of Lin Zexu, history found a man who, propelled by a sense of duty and moral clarity, would ignite a firestorm of events that would forever alter the trajectory of two nations, entwining their destinies in a conflict that would echo through the annals of time. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842. As the 1830s transitioned into the 1840s, the stage was set for a cataclysmic showdown between two formidable powers, Britain and China, in what would become known as the First Opium War. This clash, driven by deeply entrenched economic interests, cultural misunderstandings, and a profound clash of values, would redefine the global order and shape the course of history in the 19th century. Tensions between these two great entities had been simmering for years, but the appointment of Lin Zexu, the Chinese imperial commissioner charged with eradicating the opium trade, acted as a spark in this powder keg of discord. His actions, particularly the dramatic confiscation and destruction of British opium stocks in Canton, were perceived by British authorities as a direct affront to their interests and sovereignty. Diplomacy and negotiation faltered under the weight of these grievances, and the fragile equilibrium between these two nations crumbled. The inevitable outcome was war. In 1839, the first shots of the First Opium War were fired, signaling the commencement of a protracted and brutal conflict. In the early stages of the war, the British demonstrated their strategic advantage. Their formidable naval power, modern weaponry, and disciplined forces allowed them to swiftly gain the upper hand. Chinese junks and coastal fortifications, while formidable in their own right, were ill-matched against the technological might of the British Royal Navy. This naval supremacy enabled the British to secure key coastal positions and choke points, thereby strangling Chinese trade and isolating vital ports. The Battle of Chumpi, Chuanbi, and the subsequent capture of Hong Kong Island in January 1841 marked pivotal moments in the conflict. These successes underscored the British naval prowess and their ability to project power deep into Chinese territory. With each passing year, the war exacted a heavy toll on both sides. The Chinese, valiantly defending their homeland, faced daunting challenges in contending with the superior firepower and tactics of the British. The British, meanwhile, grappled with the logistical challenges of waging war in a distant and unfamiliar land. The war, marked by a series of skirmishes and battles both on land and at sea, ultimately culminated in the signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. This treaty, negotiated under the duress of British military might, represented a seismic shift in the global balance of power. Among its provisions, it ceded the island of Hong Kong to Britain, a significant territorial acquisition that would play a pivotal role in British colonial history in Asia. Additionally, the Treaty of Nanking established 5 treaty ports: Canton, Amoy, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, where British trade would be conducted under favorable terms. It also secured the infamous Most Favored Nation clause, granting Britain privileges equivalent to those enjoyed by other foreign powers in China. The First Opium War, a harrowing chapter in the annals of history, concluded with this treaty. It marked a watershed moment in the history of Sino-Western relations, introducing the notion of unequal treaties and cementing the perception of China as a weakened and subjugated nation in the eyes of the world. The Treaty of Nanking and the events of the First Opium War would set a precedent for further conflicts and alter the dynamics of global trade and diplomacy. It would also shape the course of British imperial history in China, establishing a colonial foothold that would persist for over a century. The First Opium War, with its profound and far-reaching consequences, was a somber reminder of the enduring power of commerce and the potential for conflict when the interests of nations collide. It was a war that, in the echoes of its cannons, reverberated through the corridors of history, leaving an indelible mark on the evolving narrative of the 19th century. The Treaty of Nanking and its aftermath. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842 at the conclusion of the First Opium War, stands as a watershed moment in the complex tapestry of Sino-Western relations during the 19th century. This pivotal agreement, seen as humiliating by the Chinese, not only redrew the geopolitical landscape of Asia, but also left an indelible mark on China's perception of the West and set a foreboding precedent for unequal treaties that would haunt the nation for decades to come. In the eyes of the Chinese, the Treaty of Nanking was nothing short of a national humiliation. The concessions granted to the British were not merely territorial, but also carried profound symbolic weight. Hong Kong, an island that had long been under Chinese sovereignty, was ceded to Britain. The treaty also established 5 treaty ports: Canton, Amoy, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, where the British enjoyed favorable terms of trade, further compromising Chinese sovereignty. Yet it was not just the territorial losses that embittered the Chinese, it was the perceived affront to their national dignity. The treaty included a clause that mandated the payment of an exorbitant indemnity to Britain, a sum that would further strain China's beleaguered economy. Moreover, it established extraterritoriality, a practice that granted British subjects in China immunity from Chinese law, further eroding the authority of the Qing dynasty. This combination of territorial loss, economic burden, and the erosion of sovereignty stoked deep resentment among the Chinese populace and within the ruling elite. The Treaty of Nanking was seen as a grave injustice, a betrayal of the nation's dignity, and a stark reminder of China's vulnerability in the face of Western imperialism. The treaty's signing marked a seismic shift in the dynamics of Sino-Western relations. It was not merely a product of military superiority, but a reflection of the broader asymmetries in power and technology between China and the Western powers. This unequal treaty set a precedent that would reverberate throughout the 19th century as Western nations, driven by economic interests and imperial ambitions, extracted further concessions and privileges from China. The humiliation of the Treaty of Nanking had profound and enduring consequences for China's perception of the West. It fostered a deep sense of grievance and resentment, sentiments that would fuel anti-foreign and anti-imperialist movements in the decades to come. It also catalyzed a revaluation of China's own weaknesses and a realization that reforms and modernization were imperative to defend against further encroachments. The aftermath of the treaty witnessed a surge of national introspection and a quest for reform within China. Visionaries like Lin Zexu, who had valiantly fought to eradicate opium, recognized the urgent need for modernization and reform to strengthen the nation against external pressures. This period of self-examination laid the foundation for later reform movements, such as the self-strengthening movement in the late 19th century. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860. The Second Opium War, spanning from 1856 to 1860, emerged as a grim sequel to the First Opium War, amplifying the themes of Western imperialism, economic interests, and unequal treaties that had defined the earlier conflict. It was a war that showcased the enduring tensions between China and the Western powers and culminated in a series of treaties that further entrenched foreign dominance in China. The root causes of the Second Opium War were deeply entwined with the aftermath of the First Opium War. The Treaty of Nanking, 1842, and subsequent treaties had granted Western powers significant privileges and established a template for foreign relations with China, one characterized by extraterritoriality and economic concessions. These imbalances in the Sino-Western relationship, exacerbated by the rising tide of Western imperialism, contributed to the resumption of hostilities. Tensions flared when a series of incidents, including the murder of a French missionary and the seizure of a British registered ship, ignited conflicts between Western nationals and Chinese authorities. These incidents provided the pretext for British and French forces to intervene militarily. In 1856, British and French troops launched an assault on Canton, the traditional center of foreign trade, effectively commencing the Second Opium War. The military dynamics of the Second Opium War differed from its predecessor. This time, Britain and France were joined by an additional ally, the United States, which lent further weight to the Western coalition. The conflict was marked by a series of battles, including the significant engagements at the forts of the Pearl River, where British and French forces clashed with Chinese defenders. One of the most significant moments in the war came with the capture of Beijing by the Western forces in 1860. The occupation of the Chinese capital marked a profound humiliation for the Qing dynasty and signaled the high watermark of Western military dominance in China. The culmination of these military operations led to the negotiation of a series of treaties between the Western powers and China. The Treaty of Tientsin, signed in 1856, and the Treaty of Peking, concluded in 1860, represented the denouement of the Second Opium War. These treaties, while ostensibly ending the conflict, effectively formalized and expanded the privileges that had been established after the First Opium War. The Treaty of Tientsin and the Treaty of Peking bore witness to the further erosion of Chinese sovereignty. They expanded the number of treaty ports, opened new areas of China to foreign residents and trade, and legalized the opium trade. Additionally, these treaties established diplomatic missions in Beijing, granting foreign powers a permanent presence in the Chinese capital. The Second Opium War, with its attendant treaties, deepened China's subjugation to Western imperialism. It also sowed the seeds of resentment and anti-foreign sentiment that would continue to fester in the decades to come. The opium trade, now legalized, would continue to exact a heavy toll on Chinese society, exacerbating the addiction crisis and social decay. Lasting consequences. The Opium Wars, spanning from the 1830s to the 1860s, constitute a pivotal chapter in China's history, one marked by profound and enduring consequences. These conflicts, driven by the opium trade and the aggressive encroachment of Western powers, laid bare the vulnerabilities of the Qing dynasty, reshaped China's perception of the West, and sowed the seeds of anti-foreign sentiments that would reverberate through the generations. One of the most palpable impacts of the Opium Wars was the stark revelation of China's military weaknesses. During these conflicts, China's traditional military systems and technologies were outmatched by the modern weaponry and tactics of the Western powers. The battles of the Opium Wars, particularly the First Opium War, demonstrated the inadequacies of China's naval and land forces in the face of Western aggression. The Qing dynasty, which had been the preeminent power in East Asia for centuries, found itself militarily vulnerable and ill-prepared to defend its sovereignty. The consequences of these military defeats were far-reaching. They undermined the prestige and authority of the Qing dynasty, revealing its inability to protect China's territorial integrity and maintain order within its borders. The Opium Wars exposed the systemic weaknesses within the Chinese government and military apparatus, further eroding the confidence of the ruling elite and the broader population. The unequal treaties that concluded the Opium Wars, notably the Treaty of Nanking and the Treaty of Tientsin, carried profound implications for China's national sovereignty and territorial integrity. These treaties ceded territory to foreign powers, legalized the opium trade, and established a framework of extraterritoriality, where foreign nationals were immune from Chinese law. These concessions were seen as a grave affront to China's dignity and sovereignty, and they created a palpable sense of injustice among the Chinese populace. The loss of Hong Kong to the British and the opening of additional treaty ports allowed Western powers to expand their economic and political influence within China. The opium trade, now sanctioned by treaty, continued to inflict immense harm on Chinese society, exacerbating addiction, social instability, and economic decline. Perhaps even more enduring than the territorial losses and economic concessions were the lasting consequences of anti-foreign sentiments. The Opium Wars fueled a groundswell of resentment against Western imperialism and foreign encroachments. This sentiment found expression in various forms, including the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, a massive civil war that challenged Qing authority and resulted in catastrophic loss of life. Anti-foreign and anti-imperialist movements continued to simmer throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These sentiments, amplified by the humiliation of the Opium Wars, laid the groundwork for future conflicts and played a pivotal role in the Boxer Rebellion, 1899 to 1901, a violent anti-foreign and anti-Christian movement that targeted foreign nationals and Chinese Christians. In the long view of history, the Opium Wars were a crucible of transformation for China. They exposed the nation's vulnerabilities, accelerated its encounter with the modern world, and fostered a sense of injustice and resentment that would shape its trajectory in the decades to come. These conflicts marked the beginning of a tumultuous era in China's history, one characterized by social upheaval, political reform, and the enduring quest for national rejuvenation in the face of Western imperialism. Legacy. The Opium Wars, etched into the annals of history, serve as a poignant symbol of China's turbulent encounter with Western imperialism during the 19th century. They stand as a haunting reminder of a nation's subjugation and the complex interplay of power, greed, and cultural clash that reshaped China's destiny and left an indelible imprint on its national psyche. At their core, the Opium Wars were a manifestation of Western imperial ambitions and China's vulnerability in the face of a rapidly changing world. They exposed the stark technological disparities between China and the Western powers and laid bare the systemic weaknesses of the Qing dynasty. These conflicts became emblematic of China's decline from a once dominant global power to a nation grappling with internal strife and external aggression. The unequal treaties that concluded the Opium Wars, notably the Treaty of Nanking and the Treaty of Tientsin, cast a long shadow over China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The cession of Hong Kong to Britain and the establishment of foreign-controlled treaty ports symbolized China's subjugation to foreign interests. The legalization of the opium trade, anathema to Chinese society, further fueled a sense of injustice and humiliation. The Opium Wars, therefore, became a touchstone for anti-foreign sentiments within China. They catalyzed a burgeoning awareness of the perils of Western imperialism and laid the groundwork for future movements aimed at resisting foreign influence. This sentiment would find expression in movements like the Boxer Rebellion and the wider reform and modernization efforts of the late Qing dynasty and early 20th century. Beyond China's borders, the Opium Wars were emblematic of the broader 19th century scramble for influence in Asia. Western powers, particularly Britain and France, sought to expand their economic and political footholds in the Far East. The opium trade, a lucrative source of revenue, played a central role in fueling these imperial ambitions. The Opium Wars also highlighted the tensions and rivalries among Western powers. While Britain and France cooperated in the Second Opium War, there were underlying competitive dynamics at play, as both sought to maximize their advantages in China. This interplay of interests set the stage for further conflicts and diplomatic maneuvering in Asia in the decades to come. In retrospect, the Opium Wars remain a haunting symbol of an era when China grappled with the forces of Western imperialism and the complexities of adapting to a rapidly changing world. They left an enduring mark on China's national psyche, fostering a collective memory of subjugation and igniting a determination to reclaim its rightful place on the global stage. These conflicts, emblematic of the clash between tradition and modernity, continue to resonate in China's national identity and its pursuit of rejuvenation in the 21st century. More information and facts. The Opium Trade Dynamics. The mechanics of the opium trade that fueled the Opium Wars were a complex web of economic interests, cultivation practices, smuggling networks, and staggering profits that intertwined the fate of China, British-controlled India, and British merchants in a morally reprehensible enterprise. The epicenter of the opium trade lay in the fertile regions of British-controlled India, particularly Bengal and Bihar. Here, opium poppies were cultivated on vast plantations under the strict control of the British East India Company. The cultivation of opium served a dual purpose, generating immense profits and offsetting the massive trade deficit Britain faced with China. The economic motivations for cultivating opium in India were compelling. Opium was a cash crop with a guaranteed market in China, where its addictive qualities ensured consistent and skyrocketing demand. The enormous profits from this trade flowed directly back to Britain, providing a significant source of revenue for the British government and enriching the British Empire. The opium produced in India was transported to China through a complex and covered network of trade routes and intermediaries. Initially, opium was transported overland to India's western coast, where it was shipped to China via sea routes. However, as Chinese authorities intensified efforts to curb this trade, smuggling became increasingly prevalent. British merchants engaged in elaborate subterfuges to bypass Chinese restrictions. Opium was often concealed among legitimate cargo, or it was transported under the cover of darkness to evade Chinese customs officials. These smuggling operations were carried out with a high degree of sophistication, involving both Western and Chinese intermediaries who facilitated the illicit flow of opium into China. The opium trade was driven by the lure of immense profits. Opium, once it reached Chinese shores, could be sold at prices far exceeding its production costs. This was due to both the high demand for the drug and its highly addictive nature. As a result, British merchants and traders reaped staggering profits from the sale of opium in China. These profits were not confined to individual merchants. They also bolstered the financial strength of the British East India Company and contributed to the broader British economy. The revenue generated from the opium trade became a crucial component of Britain's economic expansion during the 19th century. Chinese society and opium addiction. The opium trade's impact on Chinese society during the 19th century was nothing short of devastating, causing widespread human suffering that rippled through families, communities, and the broader societal fabric. To grasp the depth of this affliction, one must delve into the intricate web of personal tragedies and societal breakdown caused by opium addiction. Opium, initially introduced to China for its medicinal properties, gradually morphed into a recreational drug. It infiltrated Chinese society through a combination of aggressive marketing by British merchants, complicity among some Chinese officials, and economic incentives for farmers to cultivate the opium poppy. Addiction knew no bounds. It ensnared individuals across the social spectrum, from the wealthy elite to the impoverished masses. Families bore the brunt of this suffering. Opium addiction tore families apart as spouses, parents, and children succumbed to its allure. Financial resources were squandered on the drug, pushing families to the brink of destitution, homelessness, and despair. The devastation extended to communities, where opium dens became epicenters of social decay. These dens, where individuals congregated to smoke the drug, were not merely places of addiction, but also breeding grounds for crime, prostitution, and the spread of diseases. Communities reeled under the consequences of addiction. The abandonment of family responsibilities, the erosion of productivity, and the breakdown of social bonds inflicted profound harm. The loss of productive labor due to addiction exacerbated poverty, intensifying the economic hardship that gripped many areas. Opium addiction also corroded the very foundations of Chinese culture and social order. The once proud Confucian values of discipline, family, and societal harmony were eroded by the corrosive effects of addiction. The opium epidemic challenged the moral and ethical bedrock upon which Chinese society rested. Furthermore, the opium trade became a symbol of China's subjugation to foreign interests. Many Chinese perceived it as emblematic of their nation's humiliation at the hands of Western imperialism. The notion of foreign powers profiting from the addiction of the Chinese people fueled a deep sense of resentment and anti-foreign sentiment. The human suffering caused by opium addiction was immeasurable. Families were shattered, communities were ravaged, and the broader societal fabric was frayed. Individuals afflicted by addiction experienced physical and mental deterioration, often ending their lives in abject misery. The role of opium in global trade. The Opium Wars, framed within the broader canvas of 19th-century global trade dynamics, reveal the pivotal role of opium as a commodity in the global economy and its intricate connections to various aspects of international trade. In this context, opium emerges as a symbol of the complexities and contradictions inherent in the era's global commerce. Opium, primarily sourced from British-controlled India, occupied a unique place in the global trade landscape of the 19th century. Its significance lay not only in its economic value, but also in its intertwined relationships with other commodities and global trade dynamics. Commodity of global significance. Opium was a commodity of immense economic importance. It served as a cash crop for British-controlled India, generating substantial revenues that contributed to the economic expansion of the British Empire. Simultaneously, it became a key trading item in the burgeoning Chinese market, thanks to its addictive properties and sustained demand. The profitability of the opium trade was staggering. The vast profits reaped from selling opium in China flowed back to Britain, providing a significant source of revenue for the British government and enriching British merchants. This infusion of wealth played a role in fueling Britain's industrialization and economic growth during the 19th century. Interconnected trade networks. Opium's journey from India to China was embedded in a complex web of interconnected trade networks. Initially, opium was transported from India's opium-producing regions to its western coast, where it was shipped to China via sea routes. This process involved the exchange of various goods, including textiles and manufactured products, in addition to opium. Opium smuggling routes, which became increasingly prevalent as Chinese authorities sought to curb the trade, intertwined with broader patterns of illegal trade in the region. These routes often facilitated the illicit movement of various goods, blurring the lines between legitimate and contraband commerce. Opium and the balance of trade. Opium's significance extended beyond its economic value. It played a pivotal role in addressing Britain's chronic trade deficit with China. China was a coveted market for British merchants, but the Chinese government tightly controlled foreign trade, resulting in a trade imbalance. Opium became the solution to this imbalance. By exporting opium to China, Britain could offset the massive amounts of silver it was paying for Chinese goods, particularly tea. This opium for tea trade, while profitable for Britain, exacerbated the opium addiction crisis in China. Chinese resistance and heroes. Chinese resistance against the opium trade and foreign imperialism during the 19th century manifested in various forms, with notable figures like Lin Zexu emerging as heroes of this struggle. Their efforts were rooted in a profound commitment to protecting Chinese sovereignty, yet they faced formidable challenges in their quest. Lin Zexu and the fight against opium. Lin Zexu, appointed as the Chinese Imperial Commissioner in 1839, played a central role in the fight against the opium trade. He initiated a series of decisive actions aimed at eradicating the drug from Chinese society. These actions included the confiscation and destruction of opium stocks and compelling British merchants to surrender their opium. Lin Zexu's determination and moral conviction were remarkable. He viewed opium as a scourge that not only debilitated individuals, but also threatened the very fabric of Chinese society. His resolute stance against the opium trade made him a symbol of resistance and a hero to many. Challenges to Chinese resistance. Chinese efforts to combat the opium trade and foreign imperialism faced numerous challenges. Foremost among these was the military and technological disparity between China and Western powers. The Opium Wars demonstrated China's vulnerability in the face of modern weaponry and tactics wielded by the British and French forces. Additionally, internal divisions within the Qing dynasty and corruption among some officials hindered coordinated resistance. While figures like Lin Zexu were resolute in their opposition to opium, not all officials shared this commitment, leading to inconsistencies in policy and enforcement. Foreign powers also leveraged economic and political pressure to protect their interests in the opium trade. The profitability of the trade for Britain and other Western nations created powerful incentives to maintain it, despite Chinese opposition. Moreover, the Opium Wars themselves were precipitated by British military actions in response to Chinese efforts to suppress the opium trade. The resulting treaties, such as the Treaty of Nanking, imposed significant territorial and economic concessions on China, exacerbating the challenges faced by those advocating for Chinese sovereignty. Western perspectives. Western powers, particularly Britain and France, engaged in the Opium Wars driven by a complex interplay of economic, geopolitical, and imperialist motivations. Their actions were emblematic of the broader Western expansion into Asia during the 19th century, with opium serving as both a catalyst and a symbol of their ambitions. Economic interests. Economic interests were paramount in motivating Western powers to engage in the Opium Wars. The opium trade, primarily controlled by British merchants and facilitated by the British East India Company, was exceptionally lucrative. The enormous profits reaped from selling opium in China constituted a significant source of revenue for Britain and contributed to its economic growth during the era of industrialization. Opium also played a crucial role in addressing Britain's chronic trade deficit with China. By exporting opium to China, Britain could offset the massive amounts of silver it was paying for Chinese goods, particularly tea. This economic motive underscored the importance of the opium trade to Britain's economic stability. Geopolitical interests. Geopolitically, Western powers sought to expand their influence and presence in Asia, where China was a coveted market. China's opulent resources, both in terms of its consumer market and its potential for raw materials, presented an irresistible opportunity for Western imperialists. The Opium Wars also occurred within the broader context of imperial competition. Britain, in particular, sought to assert its dominance and secure its interests in China in the face of rival imperial powers, including France. The Second Opium War, where British and French forces fought against the Chinese, highlighted the competitive dynamics among Western powers in China. Imperialist ambitions. The Opium Wars were emblematic of broader imperialist ambitions, where Western powers sought to extend their influence, control, and economic dominance over Asian nations. The opium trade, as both a source of wealth and a means of exerting leverage over China, epitomized this imperialist drive. These imperialist ambitions went beyond economic interests. They were intertwined with notions of cultural superiority and the belief in Western civilization's mission to spread its influence across the globe. The Opium Wars were a manifestation of this ideology, where Western powers, with their advanced military technology and economic power, sought to impose their will on China. The impact on Chinese art and literature. The Opium Wars left an indelible mark on Chinese art and literature during the 19th and 20th centuries, as they became a recurring theme and symbol of national trauma, humiliation, and resistance in creative expressions. This period saw the emergence of a distinct genre of artistic and literary works that grappled with the harrowing experiences and the enduring impact of these wars. Depictions of trauma and suffering. Chinese art and literature of the 19th and 20th centuries often portrayed the traumatic consequences of the Opium Wars. Paintings, poems, and novels vividly depicted the suffering of individuals and communities ravaged by opium addiction and the violence of the wars. These works served to evoke empathy and galvanize social awareness about the human toll of these events. Symbolism of national humiliation. The Opium Wars were frequently portrayed as a symbol of China's national humiliation at the hands of Western imperial powers. Artistic and literary works often conveyed a sense of wounded national pride, with China personified as a victim of foreign aggression. This theme of national humiliation became a rallying point for Chinese artists and writers, seeking to inspire a sense of resilience and determination in their audiences. Patriotism and resistance. Many artists and writers used their creative talents to foster a spirit of patriotism and resistance. They depicted heroes like Lin Zexu, who stood up against the opium trade, as symbols of Chinese resilience and defiance. These works aimed to instill a sense of national pride and the importance of defending Chinese sovereignty. Exploration of identity and modernization. The trauma of the Opium Wars also prompted introspection about China's identity and its path toward modernization. Some literary works delved into questions of cultural preservation, the clash between tradition and modernity, and the search for a renewed national identity in the face of external pressures. These themes added depth to the artistic and literary responses to the Opium Wars. Political commentary. Art and literature often served as vehicles for political commentary. Writers and artists critiqued not only foreign imperialism, but also domestic issues such as corruption and weaknesses within the Qing dynasty. These critiques contributed to broader discussions about reform and the need for change in China. Continued influence. The influence of the Opium Wars on Chinese art and literature continued well into the 20th century and beyond. These events remained a source of inspiration for artists and writers, exploring themes of national identity, resistance, and the enduring impact of historical trauma. Legacy on Chinese foreign policy. The Opium Wars exerted a profound and lasting influence on China's foreign policy in the 20th and 21st centuries, shaping its diplomatic relations and approach to international affairs. These historical traumas continue to reverberate, informing China's stance on sovereignty, territorial integrity, and its role on the global stage. Sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Opium Wars, marked by foreign aggression and unequal treaties, left an enduring legacy of Chinese determination to safeguard sovereignty and territorial integrity. This commitment is deeply ingrained in China's foreign policy. The experience of foreign encroachment during the Opium Wars fuels China's resolute defense of its sovereignty, particularly regarding sensitive issues such as Taiwan and Tibet. Non-interference and anti-imperialism. The Opium Wars instilled in China a strong aversion to foreign interference in its internal affairs. This principle of non-interference became a cornerstone of China's foreign policy. It's often cited in opposition to external criticisms of China's domestic policies, such as its stance on human rights or political governance. China's foreign policy rhetoric frequently invokes its own history as a victim of imperialism, emphasizing its commitment to anti-imperialist causes globally. This legacy fuels China's support for nations perceived as struggling against Western dominance. Assertive diplomacy and nationalism. The trauma of the Opium Wars contributed to the development of a strong sense of Chinese nationalism. This nationalism shapes China's diplomacy in the modern era, often resulting in assertive and uncompromising positions on issues deemed vital to national interests. China's assertiveness on territorial claims in the South China Sea, for example, reflects a commitment to safeguarding sovereignty, influenced by its historical experiences. The Opium Wars provide a historical backdrop for understanding China's assertive stance in such matters. The quest for a multipolar world. China's foreign policy vision seeks to establish a multipolar world order. This reflects a desire to counterbalance the dominance of Western powers, echoing the historical struggle against Western imperialism during the Opium Wars. China's engagement in international organizations and initiatives, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, is seen as a way to expand its global influence and foster a more multipolar global order. This aligns with the nation's desire to prevent the recurrence of the imperialist domination it endured in the 19th century. Economic diplomacy and global influence. Economic diplomacy has become a central element of China's foreign policy. The economic legacy of the Opium Wars, where trade imbalances led to China's subjugation, informs China's focus on economic development and trade as tools for global influence. China's engagement with numerous nations through trade and investment initiatives reflects its intention to reshape global economic dynamics. Comparative Perspective. Comparing the Opium Wars and Western imperialism in Asia with other instances of Western imperialism and colonialism around the world reveals common themes and differences in the responses of affected nations. While each case is unique, several patterns emerge. Common themes. Economic exploitation. Western imperialism, whether in Asia, Africa, or the Americas, often revolved around economic exploitation. Western powers sought valuable resources, labor, and markets to fuel their industrialization and economic growth. The Opium Wars, similarly, were driven by Britain's desire to address its trade deficit with China and profit from the opium trade. Cultural dominance. Imperial powers frequently imposed their own cultural norms, language, and systems of governance on colonized territories. This cultural dominance aimed to reinforce the supremacy of the colonizers. In China, the imposition of unequal treaties and extraterritorial rights by Western powers during and after the Opium Wars exemplified this. Resistance and nationalism. Colonized nations often responded with resistance and the emergence of nationalist movements. This resistance could take various forms, from armed uprisings to nonviolent protests and diplomatic efforts. In China, the Opium Wars and the resulting humiliations fueled a strong sense of nationalism and a commitment to protecting sovereignty. Differences and nuances. Sovereignty and responses. While many nations resisted imperialism, the nature of their responses varied. Some, like India, employed nonviolent civil disobedience led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi. Others, like Algeria, engaged in prolonged armed struggles for independence. China's response included both diplomatic and military efforts, such as the Boxer Rebellion. Impact on governance. The impact of imperialism on governance differed. In some cases, colonial powers directly administered territories, while in others, they exerted indirect control through local rulers. In China, the Qing dynasty continued to nominally govern, but it faced severe challenges to its authority. Colonial legacies. The legacies of imperialism continue to shape nations differently. Some countries emerged from colonization with stronger institutions and infrastructure, while others struggled with post-colonial conflicts. In China, the legacy of the Opium Wars informs its foreign policy, emphasizing sovereignty and non-interference. Globalization and geopolitics. The context of Western imperialism varied with changing global dynamics. The Opium Wars took place during a period when Western powers were expanding their influence globally. In contrast, decolonization movements in the mid-20th century were influenced by Cold War geopolitics. In summary, the Opium Wars and Western imperialism in Asia share common themes with other instances of Western imperialism and colonialism around the world, including economic exploitation, cultural dominance, and resistance. However, the specific responses, impact on governance, colonial legacies, and geopolitical contexts vary, leading to nuanced differences in the historical trajectories of affected nations. These comparisons offer insights into the complex dynamics of imperialism and its enduring consequences.